My mother-in-law called my daughter's quilt a rag pile. She said it right in front of Maisie. My daughter was 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, holding up this quilt she'd spent 3 weeks making, 3 weeks of her tiny fingers pushing that needle through fabric, asking me every single night if Grandma Evelyn was going to love it. And my mother-in-law looked down at it, tilted her head, and said, "What is this supposed to be? It looks like a rag pile, honestly." Maisie didn't cry. That's what broke me. She just folded it back up, very carefully, corner to corner, the way I'd taught her, and she said, "Okay. Just okay." Like she'd already learned at 7 that some people don't deserve your tears. I took the quilt home. Evelyn didn't ask for it. Didn't even glance back when we left. I want to tell you what happened 4 years later. But first, I need to go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without understanding who Maisie is, and who Evelyn was, and why that quilt was never just a quilt. My daughter was born 6 weeks early. She spent the first 18 days of her life in the NICU at St. Mary's in Columbus, Ohio, and during those 18 days, I learned what it felt like to love something so completely that breathing became optional. She came home small. She stayed small. The pediatrician used words like developmental delays and occupational therapy, and I wrote all of it down in a notebook because writing things down was the only way I could hold myself together. My husband Daniel was steady through all of it. I want to be honest about that. He showed up. He drove to every appointment. He learned the exercises. He sat on the floor with Maisie and did the hand-strengthening activities with her until she giggled and squirmed away. He was a good father. He still is. His mother was a different story. Evelyn had been a force my entire marriage. Not cruel exactly, just the kind of woman who had a very fixed idea of how things should be, and very little patience for reality when it didn't cooperate. She'd raised Daniel in a 3-story house in Westerville, she had a wine cellar and a cleaning service, and she'd had opinions about our apartment and our second-hand furniture and my decision to take a part-time job instead of a full-time one from the moment we got married. She never said anything directly. It was always, "Oh, interesting choice," or "I suppose that works for some people." When Maisie was diagnosed with a sensory processing disorder at age 3, Evelyn's response was to send us an article about discipline, not sensory processing, discipline. Like she was suggesting the problem was that we'd simply failed to be strict enough. I stopped expecting anything from her after that. But Maisie was 7, and Maisie still had hope in places I'd already given up on. She'd seen Evelyn's quilts. Evelyn made these elaborate museum-quality quilts, had been doing it for 40 years, and they were genuinely stunning. Cathedral windows. Double wedding rings. One she'd made for Daniel's childhood bedroom that won a ribbon at the Ohio State Fair in 1987. She kept that ribbon framed in her hallway. Maisie asked me sometime in early October if she could learn to quilt. She wanted to make one for Evelyn, for Christmas. I should tell you something about Maisie and her hands. Because of the sensory issues and the fine motor delays, small precise work was hard for her. Not impossible. She worked at things with a stubbornness that still makes me emotional to talk about, but hard. Threading a needle took her 10 minutes the first time. She cried once, quietly, and then she wiped her face and asked me to show her again. We worked on it every evening after school. I bought her a fat quarter bundle in Evelyn's favorite colors, navy, cream, and deep burgundy, because I'd noticed those were the colors Evelyn always used. Maisie chose a symbol 9-patch pattern, which I told her was a classic, which was true. Though I didn't tell her it was also a beginner pattern. She didn't need to know that. What she needed to know was that she was making something real. 3 weeks. That quilt took her 3 weeks. It was small, lap-sized, maybe 36 by 48 inches, and the seams were not perfectly straight and 2 of the blocks were slightly uneven, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life. She wrapped it herself in brown craft paper and tied it with a ribbon she picked out at Michael's. She spent 20 minutes picking the ribbon. She chose a deep red one. We drove to Evelyn's on Christmas Eve afternoon. The house smelled like pine and cinnamon, and Daniel's sister Patrice was there with her husband and their 2 boys, and there was a fire going, and for about 40 minutes it felt like maybe things would be fine. Maisie waited until after dinner. She brought the package out from behind her chair. She'd been sitting on the edge of her seat all through the meal, vibrating with this quiet excitement that I knew meant something big was coming. And she carried it over to Evelyn and said, "I made this for you. I made it myself." Evelyn set down her wine glass. She opened it slowly, the way you open something when you're already deciding what to say about it. She unfolded it. She held it up. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds. It felt like a season. "What is this supposed to be?" she said. "It looks like a rag pile, honestly." "Maisie, sweetheart, I have a whole room of quilts. I don't need one that looks like this." She folded it back up. Not carefully, just folded it and set it on the end table like something to be dealt with later. Patrice looked at the wall. Her husband suddenly needed to check on the boys. Daniel looked at me, and I saw something go through his face that I didn't have words for until much later. And I think the word is shame, not for Maisie, but for his mother. Maisie picked the quilt up off the end table. She folded it back the right way, corner to corner. She said, "Okay," and she came back to her seat. I don't remember the rest of that evening. I don't think I spoke more than 12 words. I know I drove home because Daniel had had wine. I know I put Maisie to bed, and I stood in the hallway outside her door for a while, listening, but she'd already fallen asleep. I took the quilt out of her backpack, and I brought it to our room, and I put it in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. I wasn't sure why. I just couldn't let it go anywhere. In the morning, Maisie opened her other presents. She didn't mention the quilt. She didn't mention Evelyn. She played with her new art kit and ate pancakes and sang along with the radio. And I watched her and thought, how does she do that? How does she know already how to put something down like that? I asked her about it once, a few weeks later, gently. She shrugged and said, "I don't think Grandma Evelyn knows how hard things are for me." And then she went back to her book. I didn't tell her I'd kept the quilt. She didn't ask. The years after that were unremarkable in the way that hard years often are from the outside. Maisie kept growing. She started middle school. The occupational therapy worked, slowly and then all at once, the way those things do, and by the time she was 10, her handwriting was better than mine, and she was doing needlepoint at the kitchen table while she watched TV, the needle moving fast and sure, like she'd been doing it her whole life. She stopped quilting, though. She moved on to embroidery, then cross-stitch, then a phase where she was completely obsessed with weaving on a little cardboard loom she got from the library's makerspace. I didn't push the quilting. I figured that chapter was hers to close. Evelyn and I remained cordial. That's the word, cordial. We saw her at holidays and a few Sunday dinners a year, and she asked about school and commented on how tall Maisie was getting. And I smiled and answered her questions. And we both understood, without ever saying it, that there was a part of the story we weren't going to talk about. Daniel brought it up once. About a year after Christmas, he said, "I should have said something." I told him I knew. He said it wouldn't happen again. I told him I knew that too. We didn't discuss it further. There's a kind of grief you can have for a moment you can't undo, and the only thing you can do with it is decide what you do next time. When Maisie was 9, she entered a school art fair. Not quilts. Drawings. She'd started doing these densely detailed pen and ink illustrations, tiny cross-hatching and elaborate borders, the kind of work that made her art teachers stop by our table at open house and say, "I want you to know your daughter has a very unusual kind of patience. I don't know how to teach that. She already has it." When Maisie was 10, her teacher submitted one of her pieces to the Young Artists of Ohio competition without telling us. We found out when a letter arrived. Honorable mention. Maisie cried. Happy crying, the kind where you're laughing while it happens. When Maisie was 11, she went back to quilting. I don't know exactly why. She never fully explained it. She just asked me one Saturday if we still had the fat quarter bundles from Michael's, and I said I thought we might. And she went and found them and came downstairs and said, "I want to try something different this time." What she made over the next 4 months was not a 9-patch quilt. It was a quilt about her own hands. She told me that partway through. I walked into the kitchen one evening and she was sketching the pattern and she looked up and said, It's about my hands. Like, what they couldn't do before and what they can do now. The blocks weren't traditional patterns. She'd designed them herself, these abstract, geometric forms that had a kind of visual rhythm to them, and in the center of the quilt was a single block that looked, if you stepped back, like an open hand. I did not know she could do that. Her occupational therapist, whom we still saw twice a month out of habit and genuine fondness by that point, came over for dinner and saw the quilt on the design wall Maisie had rigged up in her room. She stood in the doorway for a long time, then she said, "Maisie, I want to ask you something. There's a fiber arts show in April at the Columbus Museum of Art. I sit on the Youth Advisory Committee. Would you let me submit this?" Maisie was 11 years old and she said, "I'd have to finish the binding first. I want to be very careful about how I tell this next part." The show was called Emerging Threads, Young Artists in Fiber, and it was a juried exhibition, meaning a panel of people who actually knew what they were talking about had to select the work. Maisie was 12 when it opened. The quilt was finished by then, bound, labeled, everything, and she and I drove it down to the museum in March for the intake submission. And she handed it to the volunteer at the desk, and the woman unfolded it and went very still and said, "Did you make this yourself?" "Yes, ma'am." "How old are you?" 11. "I'm 12 now, though." The woman looked at me. I shrugged like I didn't know what to do about it either. 3 weeks later, we got the acceptance letter. The show opened April 14th. I debated whether to tell Evelyn. I want to be transparent about that. I thought about not telling her. I thought about letting the whole thing happen and never mentioning it, because some part of me knew exactly how it might go and I wasn't sure I wanted that particular piece of the story. But Maisie asked me, the week before the opening, if Grandma Evelyn was coming. And I saw the same look she'd had at 7, the quiet hope behind it, and I couldn't say no. I texted Evelyn the details and said Maisie would love to see her there if she was able to come. Evelyn replied that she'd check her calendar. She came. She arrived at the museum with Patrice, 20 minutes into the opening, and she was wearing her good blazer, and she had her reading glasses on a chain. And she walked in and looked around at the exhibit and I watched her face do something I hadn't seen it do before. Maisie's quilt was near the entrance. Not a small placement. It was mounted on the primary feature wall, lit from above, and beside it was a small printed placard that read, "Maisie H. Age 12. Columbus, OH. What my hands remember. Hand-quilted cotton and linen, 4860 in." Evelyn stopped walking. She stood in front of it for a long time. Long enough that Patrice drifted over to look too and then drifted away to find Maisie. Long enough that other people moved around her, pausing to look, a few of them reading the placard, a few of them reading the placard, a few of them taking photographs. Then she turned around and she found me in the room, and she said, quietly, not performing it for anyone, just saying it, "This is the most technically accomplished quilt I have seen from an adult quilter in 20 years. I had no idea she could do this." I said, "I know." I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. But that's not the end. I want to tell you the actual end, which happened 6 weeks after the show and which I have turned over in my mind many times since. Maisie's quilt was selected, after the exhibition closed, as one of 6 pieces from the youth show to be displayed in the Permanent Education Gallery. The museum acquired it for their teaching collection. They paid for it, a formal acquisition, not a large amount, $3,000, which is a real amount of money for a 12-year-old, but not what this story is really about. What this story is really about is what happened when Evelyn called. She called on a Tuesday evening, and she asked to speak to me privately. And when Daniel had taken Maisie to soccer practice, she said, "I've been thinking a lot about that quilt. I know some people in the regional quilting community, and I think if I made some calls, there could be some opportunities, shows, commissions, collectors. You'd want someone with connections to help navigate that, and I'm well positioned to." I let her finish. I really did. Then I said, "Evelyn, the quilt is in the museum's permanent collection now. They acquired it 6 weeks ago." Silence. "We don't need help navigating anything," I said. "Maisie has an advisory relationship with the museum education department now. She's doing a workshop with their fiber arts curator in the fall. She figured it out herself." More silence. Then she said, "Well, I just want to be involved. I'm her grandmother." And I said, "And I want you to understand that I said this calmly without heat because I was long past the point of heat. You had the chance to be involved. She made you a quilt when she was 7 years old, and she carried it to you herself." I think about that a lot. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. And then she said, "I know, just that. I know." I think that was the closest she ever came to an apology. I know it cost her something to say it. I've thought about whether it was enough, and I've landed in the same place I always do, which is that it doesn't matter if it was enough for me. What matters is whether Maisie wants a relationship with her, and Maisie, infuriatingly, beautifully, does. Cautiously, on her own terms, she invited Evelyn to the fall workshop. Evelyn came. They sat next to each other and looked at historical quilts under magnification and didn't say much, but they were in the same room, and Maisie seemed okay with that. The cedar chest is still at the foot of our bed. The first quilt, the rag pile, is still in it. I asked Maisie last year if she wanted it back, now that she's 13 and has opinions about everything. She thought about it for a second. "No," she said. "You keep it. It's yours." I didn't ask what she meant by that. Sometimes you just let a thing be what it is. That quilt is mine because I was the one who believed in it when no one else did. I was the one who watched her thread that needle 10 times before it finally caught. I was the one standing in the hallway at midnight wondering how a 7-year-old already knew how to fold herself back up and keep going. I think about Evelyn sometimes, standing in front of that museum wall. The way she went still. The way she said, "I had no idea." And I think that was the whole problem, wasn't it? You never looked. You decided what something was worth before you even let yourself see it. I looked. I kept it. I watched. And that's the only thing I know for certain. I did right. I've thought a lot about what actually changed the night Evelyn stood in front of that museum wall and went quiet. Not what she said afterward. Not the phone call. Not the, "I know." But that specific moment when she stopped moving and just looked. Because Evelyn is not a person who stops. She walks into rooms already talking. She has an opinion before she has the full picture. That's not a cruel thing, necessarily. A lot of people are built that way. But it means that when she finally did stop, something real happened. Something she couldn't manage or redirect. And I think what stopped her was the simple, undeniable fact that she had been wrong, and the proof of it was mounted on a wall under museum lighting with a placard next to it. That's the thing about dismissing someone too early. You don't just miss what they are. You guarantee that when they become it fully, you'll be standing outside the glass, looking in. Maisie didn't set out to prove anything. I want to be clear about that. She made the first quilt because she loved her grandmother. Or wanted to, anyway. Wanted the version of a grandmother that she'd built in her head. She made the second quilt because she had something to say about her own hands, about the years of working at something that didn't come easy, about what it feels like to finally close the distance between what you want to do and what your body will let you do. That quilt wasn't revenge. It was just the truth of her, made visible, and I think that's what gets me, still, when I let myself sit with it. Maisie never stopped. Not after Christmas Eve. Not after the folded-up quilt on the end table. Not after the okay that she said in that small, careful voice. She just kept going. She picked up the needle again. She taught herself new things. She designed her own pattern at 11 years old, and she sat at the kitchen table night after night, and she made it real. There is a kind of intelligence in that. Not the kind you test for. Not the kind that shows up on a report card, but the kind that knows the difference between what someone says about you and what you actually are. Maisie knew, even at 7, that Evelyn's opinion of the quilt was not the quilt's truth. She didn't have the words for that yet, but she knew it. And she kept that knowing somewhere safe inside herself. And she built on it, and 4 years later it was hanging in a museum. I kept the first quilt because I knew it mattered. I didn't know how exactly. I just knew that something made with that much effort and that much love does not belong in a trash pile, metaphorical or otherwise. I think that's what we owe the people we love, especially the young ones, the ones still figuring out what they're made of. We owe them the dignity of being taken seriously before the rest of the world catches up. Evelyn missed that window. She got a different one, smaller, later. She's still in Maisie's life, because Maisie chose that, not because she forgot, but because she's built that way, generous in a manner that I honestly don't think she learned from any of the adults around her. She just came with it. The cedar chest is still at the foot of our bed. I'll keep that quilt as long as I live, not as a record of what Evelyn did wrong, as a record of what Maisie did right. Every single stitch of it.